Isn't that game dead? This is a question I've heard constantly the past decade on the internet. Now, I'm sure it's something that people started saying out ironically as a joke. But for the last 5 years at least, that blatantly funny side of it has shifted away, and it's being treated now like a serious discussion point, with people apparently oblivious to how ridiculous it is to ask. It comes up over and over again for some games where it was never relevant to ask, and too rarely for games where it actually is. So, today, I'm going to unpack the topic and establish quite simply why I hate being asked this oversimplified BS question. To put this simply at the header, when people ask if a game is dead, they're making a ton of assumptions out of the gate about what it means for that game to be alive. The answer is going to depend on multiple layers of other things that are usually specific from game to game, and they take time to learn about and to talk about. But this context doesn't seem to matter. It's got to be a simple question with a simple answer. And on the surface of it, I would say most people are obsessed with the matter of player population. So that's where I'm going to start talking about. And that's not simple either. Population seems like a perfectly reasonable and important thing to wonder about if you're looking to get into a new game or continue playing something you're already in. But it is important to ask, right here at the beginning, whether population even matters. Obviously, in a lot of circumstances it does, but in many it doesn't. Let's roll through it. First, talking about in-game. So, if the game you are looking to play is filled with co-op or even reliant on co-op experiences, then yes, obviously you should be wondering, are there people for me to play with? If you're a social recluse who spends all of their time on the internet and has no friends that you can pick up to actually play said co-op game, then yeah, you're going to struggle. There aren't many games that force you to be co-op, but I would say that there are a lot of experiences out there that are way better when played co-op, like looter shooter genre. I personally would get way less enjoyment out of, say, Borderlands 2 or 3 that I played recently if I had been doing them totally alone. Some story-oriented games are actually much worse when you're playing co-op just because it's harder to focus on the actual narrative that's being delivered to you because of the communications going on in the background. Some games get too easy when they're being played cooperatively. So this isn't a game breaker, but yeah, you want to consider that. Then you have the phenomenon of some games having different features within them calibrated for different numbers of players. MMOs spring to mind here particularly. If you're in a raiding-oriented MMO where most of the content isn't that great unless you're in the raiding section and you are a raiding-inclined human being, population is going to matter a lot more if all of those raids are all the way up at a 20-man format, or if you like playing in really big battleground experiences where you'll need even more players than that than you could just gather together with your own friends. Now population matters more. But to suggest that every player in a raiding-oriented MMO has to raid and can't touch any of the other stuff, you can't answer quickly. That's not a question that someone can just give you by asking, is the game dead? That's something you have to seriously consider where your priorities lie. And here's something interesting to think about. Friendly competition within games where there isn't any co-op or very low number co-op. If I look back to Guild Wars 2's early days when the maximum party size was just 5 and most of the dungeons weren't that interesting and could be beaten rather quickly, one of the main things that more invested players entertained themselves with was by doing speedruns of those dungeons and comparing their times to other people, or doing low-man challenge runs and comparing their challenges to what other people did. In this situation, I could certainly get in there and experience the content with very few people and a minimal population, a dead population, so to speak. But it is reliant on people outside of my little cell who are also actively interested in the same thing so that competition can thrive. So you'll see, everyone has their own personal criteria as to whether a game is dead. You can't ask for that input from someone else. I'll note as well, if you're not into a lot of this stuff I've already mentioned, most games you can get by, particularly nowadays with the kind of co-op infrastructure we get from platforms like Steam, or games themselves providing mega server type systems and smooth transitions from one place to another to make sure you're near other populations. Games can thrive with very minimal people actually playing them. I would say the one genre of gaming experience where this is most relevant is with competitive and PvP games. You can argue that sure, maybe you only need to find 3 people to actually experience, say, like a 2v2 friendly or something, but in truth, you tend to need rather large populations for quick, effective matchmaking, for skill ratings to be lined up. If I look at some really old shooters that I've tried to dip into years later, when they have specific small cult followings that do allow games to be played, I still often don't have that much fun. Like when I went back to Halo 1 on PC maybe 3 years ago, I just ran around getting sniped by these godly players that had been playing for like over a decade and were completely out of my league and pushed me out of the experience. When returning to the still active GVGs or random arenas formats from Guild Wars 1, you tend to find a certain caliber of player that will very quickly notice you're an outsider, and if you're not conforming to their very well-refined expectations of play, you can get chewed out pretty hard. So yes, you can play competitive games even with a tiny population, but in general I would say yeah, it's really relevant. Another worthwhile thing to think about on a game's scale of alive to dead is that of how much it relies on a simulated economy and virtual trading. Games with these tend to be calibrated that you shouldn't be collecting all the items or all the currencies yourself. Instead, you're meant to engage with an auction house or a trading post or direct player trading to supplement your experience. And to exist outside of that can be extremely punishing and not what the devs intended. But of course, if there's not a large population, even players that you have no connection with, suddenly areas of the virtual economy are going to dry up, prices are going to inflate in places they shouldn't be, and prices are going to go down in places where they shouldn't be so low. A lot of old MMOs, this is one of the biggest actual problems with them, where most of the experience is okay for you, except certain items that you should have been able to get once upon a time in abundance, you can't anymore. I'll note, on this topic, even very much alive games, so to speak, wherever that threshold is for you, tend to have big gaps in their economies, and that's a part of the game for some people, filling those and getting rich and playing around with the ebb and flow of what players do as populations shunt from early game experiences all the way up to late game ones, and the kind of items that they're generating starts to shift accordingly. So the fact is, many of these economies aren't perfectly smooth. That's the nature of the beast, but you lose a population, you can run into a lot of problems. That's not even talking about what bots can do to a game's economy if the devs start looking away, but more on that later. Lastly, I think the final place population might actually matter with a game is for the matter of vanity. A lot of cooperative or multiplayer experiences have a phenomenon where you get something rare and part of your reward and joy of having it is being able to show it off to someone else. Look at this thing I got. It's not even that pretty, but it's super rare and I want you to appreciate me for that. If there aren't people around, then the value you get out of vanity searching goes way down. I appreciate it's not everyone's ballpark, but it is a significant part of playing these games. Who are you supposed to share your cool experiences and loot and whatnot with if there's no one around? Again though, I would argue, you don't need a big population for this. Just playing a single game co-op, I have this experience constantly in looter shooters. I get my vanity fix from those. Does a broader population than that matter, really? Moving away from games themselves, I do think there's something important to talk about when we are interested in whether a game is alive or not. And that is the out-of-game experience of having a general community of like-minded people to talk to about whatever this phenomenon is. For example, I remember when the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim released, I walked to work that day and suddenly a ton of people I had no idea played video games at all was suddenly really interested in Skyrim and couldn't stop talking about it. When going online, many of the YouTubers I followed had started talking about it. Many of the discussion forums and threads that I had followed were really filling up with a lot more interesting stuff to consume. And this felt good. Having a lot of other people interested in a game, even if it's a single-player RPG where people aren't speedrunning or participating in friendly competition, matters. Humans are generally sociable people. We want to feel like we're a part of a broader or more interesting phenomenon we can connect to everyone else with. This can happen with any game on its new release if it's had enough hype or if it's building up and gaining a lot of momentum. People want to get in just because that momentum is there. The game itself doesn't even really matter much. I think it's stuff like this that stops a lot of people going back and playing old classics. No, it's not dated graphics or controls. People can acclimate to those quite quickly. But instead, it's how isolated you'll feel playing something no one else really is that interested in talking to you about. Or a franchise that seems to have no future anymore, making your moment-to-moment experiences not feel they're building to something bigger. This is actually one of the reasons I like speedrunners so much. The sad truth is, most games only really feel like they're a part of a large phenomenon or massive wave of hype right as they come out, then they bubble down to a general baseline. As a gamer in the 2020s, you can look back on a veritable graveyard of amazing gaming experiences, but feel like they're not going anywhere anymore and hold back. But speedrunners that really stick to these old games, they can still be discovering things 10, 20 years after the fact. Sure, they might not cultivate massive audiences, but they can rekindle something. For example, I'm super into watching classic Tomb Raider speedruns, where all the way through 2017, 18, 19, dedicated players and a small community, not many people are involved in, have been finding new strategies, new ways of breaking the game, and getting even better at it than any of us could have imagined before. That's awesome and feels like something's happening and going on, even with just a couple of people. If you asked me, is the original generation of Tomb Raider games alive? In all sincerity, I would answer yes to you, because there is news to follow, there is entertainment to be had, there are people to communicate with. And this is with one of the smallest gaming communities I've ever come across. That moves me tidily onto my next subject, the enormously stupid idea of talking about actual numbers. So people generally want to know, are there a lot of people playing a game, or a few people playing a game? Well, lots compared to what? MMOs in particular really suffer from the ill-made comparisons to World of Warcraft, the greatest, largest, single most trafficked MMO to have ever existed. People see a new MMO come out, if it didn't reach World of Warcraft's numbers, well, that means it's dead, right? Because it had to be better than WoW to be an MMO of any merit. How ludicrously foolish. Questions of this nature are an intellectual cul-de-sac. To me, it comes back to the earlier point. How many players do you actually need to feel like you matter in the game, or to have a fun experience in the game? We already established for most games, it's almost no players that actually matter. If I logged into an MMO and across that day I saw 50 separate different individuals over my 2 hours of playtime, I would say that game feels perfectly alive enough for me to make some friends, to get my vanity fixed, to feel like I'm a part of a broader phenomenon. Perhaps we would suffer a little for our in-game economy, but overall it's going to feel like a well-trafficked game. If those 50 players happen to be 50 out of the only 250 playing at the time, it doesn't really matter, does it? The MMO was structured well enough that I engage and interact with other people, so who cares? You've got the phenomenon of how meaningful those interactions are too. More traditional MMOs had a lot more cause for friction and interaction between players, but these days, things are so frictionless that often if you toggle the UI off so you can't see people's nameplates, you may encounter up to 600 people in a single play session, but none of them talk to you, none of them trade with you, so they may as well have just been NPCs or invisible. Did it really matter in the end? Back to the matter of numbers, let's talk about the idea of trends too. Let's say I started with 100,000 active daily users with my game. Doesn't have to be an MMO, doesn't have to be a competitive game, I just had all those active concurrent users. We've seen them on the Steam charts. I'm a smash success. But this month, several years down the line, I'm down to just 50,000 users a day. Suddenly, people will talk about me as though I'm a dead game, and that I'm in a worse state than other games that maybe have just been bobbling along at 10k for the past 5 years. But because there hasn't been this fairly natural transition of the population over the years as people find new pastimes, all of a sudden, the sky's falling down. Well, no, obviously not. The truth is, we have to talk about these other subjects aforementioned in the video. It's obviously important to know if there is some unfettered mass exodus going on with no end in sight, but barring a few special situations and like heavy controversies, I actually think that's extremely rare. People can spike and protest out of a game for a while, but then tend to lose their principles real quick and come around eventually. Maybe not for super new releases that were extra deceptive in their pre-launch, but those have been known to turn things around too. Some people probably only feel comfortable getting into the game if they know that it's a game that is rising in population, but games like those are a real oddity. I can guess at maybe 6 or 7 PC games over the back half of the last decade that have continued to grow or at least sustain on a mass scale, and for everything else, it tends to be early spike at release, slow trickle out afterwards. Try not to set the bar too high for yourself, and even if there is a slow trickle out, if you're still in the tens of thousands of people, I'm sure there's enough to present all the possibilities and opportunities we talked about at the start of the video. Let's talk about the idea of a game on death's doorstep, so to speak. There really isn't much of a population, and you really need to know whether it's gone below that breakpoint. We've asked and answered all the questions presented so far in this video. Well, still there's complications here, because populations don't just change in large trends over the months, but they wobble around across times of day, weeks, and months. I think low population competitive games are most familiar with this. Sometimes, you might genuinely not be able to find decent matchmaking unless you're playing that game at specifically primetime East Coast US. Then, the matchmaker won't screw you over and you'll probably be able to have a bit of fun. Can you play during that certain time of day? Well, sure, maybe in that point the game is alive. Sometimes, maybe you'd like to raid, but it turns out that the only time you can really use an LFG system for raiding is right after raiding reset on a Tuesday. Can you play on a Tuesday? Well, that's going to change whether you believe the game is dead or not. Is there currently a season on with your game or a tournament? I've had several replays through the game Path of Exile, which by most standards is an extremely active and successful game, but just through pure coincidence, it's happened that every time I've gone to it has been right near the end of one of their leagues, and there haven't been many players around in the early game zones, and there hasn't been much to interact with unless I do a lot of grind, get to the end, and then finally maybe catch up with the player base who were there at a different time of the month to me. The game felt super quiet pretty much every time I've gone in there, but I know that it's not a dead game. It's just that for a lot of products, the time you are playing is extremely important. So that's most of what I have to say on this topic, but I do have one final thought for you all, and that's the idea of developer commitment and frequency of updates. I think many people mistakenly conflate these two ideas of having an active game with a population with the developer side. Maybe what you're looking for is just a game that's being updated a lot. And yes, often you'll need a large population with a game to generate the funds to actually be able to get these updates moving, otherwise the studio will look away. But that is not always the case. There are some games with massive populations that the developers are extremely lazy about. On my long video about Guild Wars 1 versus World of Warcraft a few months ago, I was amazed to see how lazy and frightfully slow Blizzard were with updates to World of Warcraft for years, while taking a subscription fee from people, while other games with much smaller populations just continue harrying updates out in the hope that they'll be able to garner some interest or enthusiasm. I've seen the reverse too, just this week, with Lord of the Rings Online being a game with a tiny population that had just thrown out some kind of substantive patch. The Reddit thread had 2 upvotes and a single comment, but there was a full-fledged patch note from the devs. The game went down for like 5 hours to push the patch out. They were still adding meaningful stuff to the game. But Lord of the Rings Online is not something most general gamers would ever consider to be alive, even though it's getting that attention. Some of the Deep Space Nine cast members died recently. I looked at some of the recent work they did on their wiki pages. It was Star Trek Online voice work. I had no idea that that game was still getting expansions right up until 2018 or whatnot. Maybe even is still now, but the developers never stopped. There are any number of small indie games that I'm always surprised to log in on Steam and see, wow, there's something else going on with Don't Starve this year. Cly Entertainment have really put the legwork in, and well, it's paid off. They only just recently had their highest concurrent users ever after a free-to-play weekend. On the very extreme, you can look at some of those ludicrously popular Nintendo products like Super Mario 64 and the number of people still playing that, not just as speedrunners, garnering hundreds of thousands of views in 2019 and 2019-20, but just people casually playing the game, and that hasn't been altered since its initial release on the Nintendo 64, unless you count the DS remake, but we're talking mostly about the original here. So, please think very carefully about how relevant the question is when you ask, is this game dead? It's not a real question. It's an oversimplification of a ton of different facets and topics about the particular product you're looking to go into, and most of them can only be answered by you. The vast majority of games, it is completely pointless to ask if something is dead, and especially without offering further context as to who you are and what you're looking for, it is almost entirely useless to talk about. Some areas of games can die long before other areas of games, like take any number of the now empty online multiplayer modes tacked on to what would otherwise just be a single player RPG or action adventure game. There's been loads of those. Some areas can be entirely functional while supposedly dead. In fact, the vast majority of games, I would say, are like this. Some games don't need developers to actively be working on them to sustain their interests, and so on. A truly dead game, to me, really, is probably something quite rare. But a game that was maybe cancelled during development or was reliant on official servers and multiplayer to keep going, and those servers have been now shut down. But if it turned out there was a private server bringing it back from the fans, I'd probably have to add that little bit of information when answering too. And is it even truly dead there? Most games are not in this category, and you, as the consumer, should probably not feel so reliant on an arbitrarily big number in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or just hundreds of people to be allowed to enjoy something, usually. Competitive games are probably the biggest outlier and where this is most relevant. Other than that, please, stop asking such a pointless question and give people something more pointed. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.